Good morning everyone and welcome back to Tactics Board. If you're still reeling from Norwich City's 2-0 loss to Sheffield United at the weekend, then the bad news is that they have to travel to Leeds for maybe an even tougher game tomorrow night. But there is a chance for them to take a surprise result away from Elland Road, and here on Tactics Board we're going to take a look at how strategically that might happen, some of the weaknesses that they might be able to exploit from the home side, of course some of the many strengths that they have going into this game, as well as the team that I think Johannes Thorup will pick, and some of the similarities and differences between Hoffball and Farkeball as it was at this stage of his Norwich City rebuild. Certainly some interesting comparisons to be made there. But we're going to start with that predicted starting 11. So without further ado, here it is. So I've gone for Angus Gunn in goal, Jack Stacey at right back, Shane Duffy and Callum Doyle in the centre of defence, with Ben Krezene at left back, Kenny McLean, Emiliano Marcondes and Kellen Fisher in midfield, with Oscar Schwartau on the right, Lewis Dobbin on the left and Ante Cianats through the middle up front. Now I've kept most of that team the same from that Sheffield United loss, and actually I think in sort of Norwich's own third and the way that they were building up possession from goal kicks and things like that, I don't think they were too bad. The fact that Sheffield United didn't really come onto them with their press meant that it was quite easy for Duffy and Doyle in particular to pass the ball between themselves and with Gunn, and for them to get into midfield. The problem was that then Sheffield United had created this quite dense block that stopped Norwich going forward from there, and even when they did, they didn't have maybe the best decisions. So I've kept that back four and that midfield three the same, and I think Thorup will be tempted to do that. The only question is whether maybe Kellen Fisher goes back to a more natural right back position in a game that's probably going to be slightly less physical and slightly less direct than it was at Bramall Lane. But I think given how Fisher performed in midfield, and for me it was his best performance in that role in the Championship this season, I think Thorup will be tempted to keep that sort of back eight the same, given the fact that Norwich weren't too bad sort of playing out from the back and things like that. And then defensively, it was mainly through individual errors rather than anything catastrophic tactically or any real errors that they made in that sense. But I think there will need to be a change in that front three, because as I mentioned, every time that Norwich did manage to get into those good positions, it felt like the decisions weren't quite right. There wasn't quite that cutting edge, and part of it was the fact that many of the players felt like they were slightly out of position. I think although Ante Cianats does, to me, look more like a right winger than a central striker, he still doesn't really look like that's his perfect role. He looks more like a sort of number 10 to me, and somebody who could operate in a central role, if not in that main number 9 position, making those runs in behind. They obviously had Onel Hernandez through the middle up front, and he's the person who I've dropped to the bench, because although I think he does give you a good amount in terms of running, what he still wants to do is get on the ball and run at defenders, when actually he needs to be darting into the box and letting other people do that. So I've gone for Cianats through the middle instead of Hernandez, and then I've got Oscar Schwartau out on the right, who I was surprised actually didn't feature against Leeds or against Sheffield United, because of the sort of midfield problems that Norwich have, the many injuries that they have in that area. I felt this could be the game for Schwartau to maybe play in that more traditional position for him, that role that he's maybe played more often in Denmark, and I think the role that most Norwich fans feel he is more suited to in the long term. But I've gone for him here on the right wing because I think Norwich needs somebody who's a little bit more of that creative type, who will be proactive with their first touch, will look for those through balls and those quick interactions with other players, maybe some slightly more improvised chance creation opportunities, because they weren't really there for Norwich against Sheffield United. It felt like they didn't really have that typical creative player, and although I still feel that Norwich are struggling maybe for that more traditional number 10, that James Maddison, Wes Hoolahan, Emi Buendia type, I think Schwartau at the moment is the closest they have to that skill set, and with him coming off the right, I think they have a better chance of creating opportunities for Cianats up front, if that is who it is. I think a lot of people expected Josh Sargent to start this game when he was on the bench for Sheffield United, but the way that Thorup actually talked after that game, it felt like he was maybe slightly tempering those expectations. And although I'm speaking before his press conference before the Leeds game, I feel like from how he's talked, it's more likely that Sargent maybe starts against Swansea at home on Saturday, having had another decent opportunity off the bench. But that will be interesting again to see what Thorup does, given it's basically the same group of players that he had for the game at the weekend. Who comes off the bench, whether it's Lucien Mahovo and Elliot Miles again. I thought both of them were fairly decent. Mahovo probably stood out the most. So it'll be interesting to see what Thorup does do with his team, but I haven't gone for too many changes after a display against Sheffield United that wasn't great, but I think was okay in certain areas. Now on to Leeds United, and a team who I think everyone recognises are really fantastic. The number of quality players that they've got, the way that they've put everything together and maximised that talent as well. I think they are probably still just about favourites to win the Championship title this season, even though Sheffield United are looking pretty good right now and they have made some good additions and look like they'll continue to do that this January. I think Leeds do just have such strength in depth and so many really good players throughout their team, really, that they are bound to be up there, I'd say probably in the top two come the end of the season, and maybe even winning that Championship title under Daniel Farke. One thing that I'd say for Norwich is important that maybe people wouldn't think about would be the second balls. I think the number of times you see Leeds United get the ball into the box via some pretty nice passing, traditional Farkeball, and then it breaks down, but they have so many quality players in that area that if it breaks to a Leeds player, they probably will do something good with it. They probably will find a way to score a goal from it. And I think Norwich, although defensively they have those players like Shane Duffy, like Callum Doyle, who are very much willing to put their bodies on the line and get those first blocks in, if they aren't switched on and if their midfielders aren't in the right positions to get there first when those balls break in the box, Leeds have shown so many times that when you've got 6, 7, 8 really talented attacking players in those areas, you are bound to score a number of goals from that source. So I think Norwich need to be really, really good at the second balls. Obviously, possession-wise, they'll have to be patient because although Norwich like to press high and they want to win the ball as often as possible, if they do that and it isn't perfect, then Leeds have the players to play around it and to dominate possession, not only as a way of controlling the game, but also as a way of creating chances. And if Norwich do go heavy with that press and they don't get it perfect, they don't execute it as well as they need to, then you'd say that they will probably leave themselves open to Leeds. So they need to maybe either press perfectly or decide to temper those expectations compared to other games a little bit. And it will be interesting to see what Thorup does with that, because he has been fairly pragmatic in the past when he's coming up against teams who present those challenges. And I'd say that although we have seen the signs of what Thorup wants to do right now, in regards to pressing, they maybe don't have exactly the sorts of players and the sorts of familiarity with each other that they will need in future if that's going to become a real strength in their game. So that's an interesting part of it. There are probably two main areas where Norwich can get at Leeds. One of them is set pieces, and I won't need to tell Norwich fans that, given that main weakness in Daniel Farke's team, especially in the Championship where they had basically everything else over all the other teams, set pieces was still a weakness, and that's basically the situation with Leeds. They're still struggling, they're still conceding a lot of chances via those means, and if Norwich can improve on their set pieces, which admittedly haven't been great this season, then there is an avenue there for them. There's also the goalkeeper Illan Meslier, and I think most Championship fans will have seen some of the criticism that he's had this season. Plenty of errors, and if Norwich can capitalise on those, we've spoken about second balls, if they can capitalise on those in the Leeds box, then you'd say there might be a couple of errors from Meslier that they can exploit. He is a very good shot stopper, but he does have an error in him, and Norwich need to be switched on to those if and when they do happen at Elland Road. But mainly it's a team that is very, very strong. Of course, they go into this game as serious favourites, and I think Norwich will do very well to pick up even a point in this game, to be honest. To finish with, I thought it would be interesting to compare where Daniel Farke's Norwich City were at the corresponding point of his tenure to what Johannes Hoff Thorup's team are now at Carrow Road. I think there are some concerns creeping in about maybe the long-term viability of the Thorup project. It feels like there are some questions about maybe some of his decisions. maybe a portion of the fan base is starting to get a little bit tired. And I'd say that there is still, in the majority, some patience with him and some willingness to see what happens from here. But I thought, by way of comparison, it would be good at looking at the Farke team, how they were this far into his tenure, bearing in mind that, of course, that team then a few months later went on to be the best one in the Championship, and they won the title in 2019. So I think it is worth noting that there were still plenty of differences in Farke's team to what there was eventually the next season. He was still playing with a back three. There were still players like Ivo Pinto, James Maddison, Harrison Reed, Nelson Oliveira, Josh Murphy, who were all key players at this point in the season, who then obviously weren't really in the next season. I think 4 of those had left the club, and then there was Ivo Pinto, who barely played any games in that title-winning season. They were dominating possession fairly often, but not as constantly as they did in that second season, and tactically it was quite a different team. Of course, everyone was really wondering where things were going in that sense. Now I think that has helped with the patience at Carrow Road, but I can understand the questions. There have been a few games where you felt that tactically Norwich could have done a little bit better, and where the performances were questionable given some of the players on the pitch and some of the performances individually. But I think it's worth thinking about how different that Farke team was back then to then what they ended up being. And that was only a short turnaround. Of course, Norwich still have the rest of the January window. They have the whole of the summer to do what they want to that team, to continue to mould it and sculpt it. And although I do agree with some criticisms about the fact that maybe Norwich have gone a little bit too long-term with their recruitment at times, they haven't quite focused on players who are maybe in their primes or ready to contribute to the team right now. They will have several players leaving in the summer. Contractually, that looks like it's going to be a fact. And of course, there will be bids for certain players as well. There is an opportunity there for Norwich to really transform that squad and to bring players in who will go and be key players next season. You've also got the likes of Slimane, of Svartau, even of Sienats and Amankwa Forson, who you feel will probably be in a better position next season. And that's not me saying any of them have been perfect or look like title winners just yet, but you'd say that it is fairly likely, with Thorup's coaching and his record with young players, that they will be improving. So I think it's interesting as a comparison, and of course it's a comparison that's been made plenty of times. I'm certainly by no stretch the first person to do that, but I think Norwich are tracking similarly with how Farke's team were in that 2017-18 season. So it'll be interesting to see what they do in the summer, how things change from there, bearing in mind that Glenn Riddersholm told us back in the summer that the expectation was that in the third season they'd get promoted. You'd say that there is still plenty of time for them to improve. And I do understand some of the concerns. I think some of the decisions in terms of the team selection and the tactics, and maybe even sort of the transfers and the bigger picture, I think they have been questionable. But equally, there has been some good work done as well, and some work that certainly looks like it's geared to the long term. So although it might be a little bit of a struggle tomorrow night, let's hope Norwich City can surprise us in both the short term and the long term. Of course, we'll have every kit covered from Elland Road, so pinken.com/subscribe is the place to go if you haven't already. Thank you very much for joining me on Tactics Board. I'll see you again before Saturday's visit of Swansea City, when hopefully we're all feeling very positive after a shock win against Leeds. See you then.